All right, we are again picking up in our study of 2 Samuel. We concluded in chapter 13 last week, right? The end result of Amnon essentially raping his half-sister is that Absalom basically plots out the murder of Amnon. And of course, this doesn't happen right away, but over the course of a couple of years, Absalom devises a plan. Basically, where Amnon comes over, gets Amnon drunk, his servants go in, then they kill Amnon. And the result for Absalom is that, again, he feels like he has gained a sense of retribution for the harm that Amnon had caused Tamar. But of course, in this particular case, Absalom has basically ordered a man to be put to death. And as we saw last week, the response of this is for Absalom was to flee, to sort of get out of Jerusalem, and to flee, as we saw last week, to Geshur. And of course, we pointed out that, again, if David had taken the appropriate response here, which we're going to kind of get into in chapter 14, when we talk about this woman that comes to meet with David from the city of Tekoa, if David had taken the proper response here, could have very well been that this, at least Absalom having to flee from, his father's presence, maybe that doesn't happen. And certainly the rest of the events connected to Absalom's life, when he eventually goes and, creates his own rebellion to try to usurp the throne, and to take that throne away from his father. All those events could have been avoided if David had properly responded and acted in this situation as he should have, and that again is something that we're going to see come out in 2 Samuel chapter 14. Again, David has done a lot of great things in his life, but David was at the same time not a perfect person. Again, a good reminder to us that the men in the Bible were certainly men, and certainly imperfect. So, in 2 Samuel chapter 14, we're going to see that Absalom is actually going to return to Jerusalem, in part due to this occasion between David, Joab, and this woman from the city of Tekoa. And that is what we want to try to focus on this morning. I get through basically the first half of this chapter, and that'll set us up when next week we'll talk about how Absalom will then return to Jerusalem. But of course, that David, we talked about David, went through a mourning process, not just for Amnon, but for Absalom as well. I know everyone in here, most everyone here has been parents. You can kind of relate to this idea with David in the sense that, your child doesn't want to have anything to do with you or is afraid of coming home to talk to you because of what he's done. And naturally, David, as we saw at the end of the chapter, was very upset by this. And that's going to lead Joab to act in chapter 14. So when we look at 2 Samuel 14, verse 1, so Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. That directly connects back to what we have just seen. David was saddened by the fact that Absalom has fled and is no longer in David's presence. And so chapter 14 naturally picks up right after the events of chapter 13, because what's going to motivate Joab to devise this plan with the help of this woman is the fact that David has been so upset because he cannot see Absalom anymore, because Absalom has fled and will not return back. And so Joab again is going to devise a plan to basically get Absalom back to Jerusalem. Now, of course, we know that Joab was very close to David, and Joab has a major role in the story of David and Absalom, as we'll see later on. But in this particular case, Joab again acts because David's heart is still concerned about Absalom. So again, Joab knows that something's wrong with David. He's still concerned about Absalom. So verse 2, Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman, and said to her, Please pretend to be a mourner, and put on mourning apparel. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been mourning a long time for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him in this manner. So Joab put the words in her mouth. Now, the city of Tekoa wasn't necessarily a major city in Israel like a Jerusalem would have been, maybe like a Bethel would have been. But Tekoa is mentioned a few times in the Old Testament. What prophet came from the city of Tekoa?
Amos.
Yeah, Amos. Remember we talked about him, I believe, last year. Amos came from the city of Tekoa. Tekoa was a smaller town, I believe about 10 miles from Jerusalem, out in the country. Remember, Amos was sort of known to be like a country-type preacher that went to Israel and spoke against the nation of Israel. So Tekoa is a familiar city in the Bible. And in this particular case, Joab finds this woman from the city of Tekoa. We kind of have a hint here that she is an older woman. I won't necessarily say elderly, but again, the emphasis here in verse 2 is that she was a wise woman. And so a lot of times that word is going to indicate that this is a woman that is older in nature, a woman that has what we might say a greater respect within the community perhaps. And naturally, this type of woman would be somebody that you would trust. What she says is true. And that's the whole point that Joab is trying to get out of this. But again, notice the command, right? Pretend to be a mourner, right? And as we've seen before, you know, the whole mourning process in the Old Testament was a whole lot more than just going around and crying. There was certain clothing that you would wear. Obviously, not fine clothing, your worst clothing. You know, again, you don't anoint yourself with oil, and part of that is the idea you're not keeping yourself clean, you're dirty. And as we've seen before, people that are in that particular situation that don't want to put on nice clothes, that don't want to clean themselves. In the Old Testament, that's always a sign for somebody who is upset, and not just upset, but greatly upset about something. And the point is, she should act as though she's been mourning for a long time for the dead, which we're going to see what this story is a little bit in the verses following. But the point is that she is going to go to the king, and what she is going to seek from the king, at least in her mind, is the protection of her family when it comes to this matter of potentially one of her family members being put to death. At least that's how the story is going to go. But again, notice what is said there in verse 3. So Joab put the words in her mouth. And so Joab is sort of orchestrating this whole event to try to get David at least back in his right mind. And naturally, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of Joab, we know that Joab does not always have great intentions behind his actions, and that becomes clear later on. But if you think about it from just a practical perspective, right? If a king is so greatly mourning that he can't carry out his job, that doesn't bode well for a kingdom, right? Because you want your leaders to be of a sound mind, make great decisions, because obviously their decisions impact the country. That's typically when you think about presidents, for instance, we typically want a president that has a pretty clean past. You know, you don't want to have to deal with a president that, is known to be an alcoholic or known to be a drug user, because the thought behind it is you don't want to have a president that has an addiction that keeps him from having a clear and sound mind. And Joab naturally wants David to be in his right mind, to be focused on the right things to help out with the kingdom. But again, Joab, in order to get David to act here, Joab basically has to invent this story to try to get David to act. So, verse 4, when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and prostrated herself and said, "Help, O king." Then the king said to her, "What troubles you?" And she answered, "Indeed, I am a widow. My husband is dead, Now your maidservant had 2 sons, and the 2 fought with each other in the field, and there was no one to part them. But the one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole family has risen up against your maidservant, and they said, Deliver him who struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother, whom he killed, and he will destroy the heir also. So they would extinguish my ember that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the earth. So for David, this is not that uncommon for a woman to go, and basically what she is doing is pleading for the king for judgment in this matter. And if you remember back in 1 Samuel 8, one of the things that the people of Israel wanted from their king was not just to be like the other nations, but also remember that they said that they wanted a king to judge over them. Because part of what a king did was provide judgment, as we see here, as we'll see with Solomon. And that was a natural role that a king had, that sometimes in this case, because he is king, would administer judgment. And sometimes withhold judgment, or at least withhold punishment, as what this woman is wanting here. All right, so notice again verse 5. She goes, she prostrates herself, she falls before the king, bows down. Here's her problem. Indeed, I am a widow. My husband is dead. Now, let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 3. Because the Apostle Paul, at least, gives us another idea about what this statement means. At least when she says, I am a widow indeed. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 3. Dad, if you would read that for us.
Honor widows that are widows indeed.
Yeah, so the verse states that honor widows who are really widows. And the point being here is that for a woman to be considered a widow indeed, it not only meant that her husband had died, but also that she, in this case, didn't have any male children, at least of an old enough age to be able to take care of her. And that is what she... and that is part of the crux of the matter here. She is a widow indeed, not just because her husband is dead, but also because of the events that follow this. Because here she says that she had 2 sons. One of them has died because he has had a dispute with his other brother. And if her other son dies, then she becomes a widow indeed. She has no one to take care of her. Which, again, in the law of Moses, there were laws set in place to take care of widows, especially widows that were indeed widows. But note again that the story, 2 sons struggle, they fought with one another. There was no one to part them, but one struck the other and killed him. Now, what we're going to see is that this story basically is a parallel for what has happened between David, Absalom, and Amnon. And that'll come out at least a little bit later on in the chapter. But this story does seem kind of familiar, and some have pointed out that perhaps Joab borrowed from other accounts in the Old Testament to create this story. Most notably, Cain and Abel, which we remember in Genesis chapter 4, we saw an indication where Cain obviously killed his brother. Now, in that particular case, we're not told that there was a struggle between both sons. We just know that Cain, out of jealousy and hatred, just killed Abel. But some have thought that perhaps Joab borrows from that story or that account in the book of Genesis to develop this story for this woman to tell King David, which goes back again to verse 3, that Joab is orchestrating the whole thing. So there was no one to part them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the response here is that the family has risen up against your maidservant, and what they want to do is to kill the still living brother, the one who has put the other brother to death. Which, when we look at the Old Testament, this is something that the family was required to do. Notice and turn with me to Numbers chapter 35. Because what we're reading in this text, we kind of don't know. I mean, we have an idea about what's going on here, but when you tie in the law of Moses here, some of this helps put into perspective what is exactly going on. Notice Numbers 35, verse 31. Here the text says, "Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death." Now that verse is important here. And I'll go ahead and read verse 32. "And you shall take no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest." And we'll talk about that in a moment, because in a sense that kind of parallels what Absalom has done, right? He committed murder and he's fled away. But again, notice verse 31, "You shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death." Now, that is the point that the family is bringing out in this story. What this one brother has done is he has obviously committed murder. We don't get the sense here that this is an accidental killing of neglect or anything like that. The family recognizes that in Numbers 35, verse 31, the responsibility is that this brother should be put to death. Now, that is important to keep in mind, because the way that we understand it worked in the Old Testament family, if you had a situation like this, where one family member killed another family member, the closest male relative was expected to deliver the punishment. That was his responsibility in this case. Well, in this story, the closest male relative would have been the widow's husband, but she's a widow. He's died. And so the other male relatives of this woman take it upon themselves to do what her husband should have done, and that is to put this man to death. Now, how would that compare to what has happened between David, Absalom, and Amnon? Okay, Absalom's on the run. So if we put this story, this woman's story, in connection, if we connect it to David, Absalom, and Amnon, how does this connect? Absalom should be put to death, but by who?
By David.
Yeah, by David. That's the point. If David had died, then it would have been the other family members that had the responsibility of putting Absalom to death, because he was a murderer. That was the punishment that should have been administered by the law of Moses. But in this particular case, when this story connects to David, David's not really dead, right? But David has not taken it upon himself to fulfill the responsibility of putting his son to death, as he should have by the law of Moses. And that's how this kind of connects here. David's wife is not really a widow, but it's almost like she is a widow, because David has not fulfilled his responsibility in this matter of Old Testament law. And that's what this story is trying to get at. And that's how it connects again to David. I hope I make that clear. If I need to clarify that any more, I can. But that's how this story connects here. In the story, the widow's husband is dead. But in real life, with David, Absalom, and Amnon, David's not dead, but it's almost as though he is dead, because he doesn't act the way that the law of Moses required him to do that. But see, her problem is, if she allows his family to go and to kill her only son, again she says, "So they would extinguish my ember that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the earth." Right? And her point is, if my only son dies, then my husband's family dies out, which is not a good thing at all. Again, there were other Old Testament laws that whenever a husband died, the husband's older brother was supposed to take his former brother's wife and family and basically to make sure that his family would continue on after he has died. But in this case, that principle doesn't outrule the fact that one son has committed murder against another son. So here's the dilemma for David. Do I go and I administer punishment, which is what the family wants, to kill this son who is guilty of murder, or do I side with the woman whose point is I cannot kill her son because then she, or at least for her husband, they won't have any family members left, and the family will die out. So, verse 8, the king said to the woman, "Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you." And the point is, David's got to take time to think about, what do I need to do here? And before we go on, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about up to this point?
This is at least the second time that Nathan did the same thing. He came with a story, about the rich man, poor man, sheep, and so forth. So here's another occasion where you wouldn't say David's duped, but I don't know if Joab knew about Nathan, but it seems like he was easy to be not necessarily misled, but persuaded by,
manipulated.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of that is the fact that he's in. I think part of the reason why is because what we saw in chapter 13. Notice that David mourned for his son every day. And if you're a parent, you're going through a grieving process, and parents don't like to have to think about that, and even grandparents don't like to have to think about that with a child or a grandchild dying. For a while after that, you're not going to be in a right frame of mind. It takes time to move on from the death, especially the death of a child or a grandchild. And perhaps that's why David could be, I guess, manipulated in this sense, at least in this case, by Joab in telling the story. So David says to the woman, "Go back to your house. Let me think about it. I'll make a decision about what I'm going to do." So verse 9, the woman of Tekoa said to the king, "My lord, O king, let the iniquity be on me and on my father's house, and the king and the throne be guiltless." So the king said, "Whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you any more." Then she said, "Please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son." And he said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." All right, so notice what David's statement is in verse 10. And the point being is that even though the son has committed murder, some people might try to enact justice for this crime by harming this widow. And even though she's guiltless or innocent in this story, as we can tell, some might take the idea that if we cannot administer punishment to the guilty party, then we will take and administer punishment to the widow, who is obviously the mother of the guilty party. And sometimes this idea is used, I know it's been used in countries like North Korea. If you've ever watched videos of people who have defected from North Korea, one of the things that they talk about is that, and one of the reasons why they a lot of times don't show their face in public, and if you watch an interview, they'll blur their face out or they won't show them. It's because if the North Korean government figures out who this individual is, a lot of times they punish the family, which, again, a member doesn't really want that to happen. Did you have a comment, Brother George?
This also reminds us when she says in verse 9 that, "O king, the iniquity may be upon me."
Mm-hmm.
She is taking on herself, just like the Lord took upon himself of our sins.
Mm-hmm.
You put these sins on me and be my responsibility not my son, will spare him
Right.
by me taking on his crime.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, I get that picture.
Yeah.
That's the way she can see, and also it's the way to let David be out from under his responsibility.
Absolutely.
Because she has assumed the guilt.
Yeah, and that's part of the point too, and that's a good point to bring out, Brother George, because she obviously wants the king to rule in her favor in this story. Why not help the king in his decision-making process out by telling the king, "Look, I take full responsibility for what has happened. You're not going to be held responsible. The guilt, or at least the bearing of the sin, will not be in your position because I will take on the full responsibility." And so naturally, making a statement like that in favor of the king would, in a way, would help persuade the king to rule in her favor. That's a really good point to bring out. So David provides protection for her. I do want to note again verse 11. Then she said, "Please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son." Now, the avenger of blood is another reference to the law of Moses. And let's, for a moment, look at Numbers chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. The responsibility of the avenger of blood was that he was the individual that was supposed to administer, in this particular case, the punishment that was given towards a murderer. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 19, and let's look at verses 3 through 10. Now, in the Old Testament, according to the Old Testament law, there were what were called cities of refuge, which if somebody fled to the city of refuge, they, in a sense, were protected from the avenger of blood, which is what this woman is invoking here. But let's look, Deuteronomy 19, verses 3 through 10. "You shall prepare roads for yourself and divide into 3 parts the territory of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, that any manslayer may flee there. And this is the case of the manslayer who flees there, that he may live. Whoever kills his neighbor unintentionally, not having hated him in time past." And this is talking about accidental killings here. "As when a man goes to the woods with his neighbor to cut timber, and his hand swings a stroke with an axe to cut down the tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies." In that particular case, right, this is an accidental killing. He didn't mean for the head of the axe to fall off the handle to strike his neighbor and kill him. This is an accidental killing. "He shall flee to one of the cities and live, lest the avenger of blood, while his anger is hot, pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and kill him, though he was not deserving of death, since he had not hated the victim in time past. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall separate 3 cities for yourself. Now if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he swore to your fathers, and gives you the land which he promised to give to your fathers, and if you keep all these commandments and do them, which I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to walk in all his ways, then you shall add 3 more cities for yourself beside these 3, lest innocent blood be shed in the midst of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and thus guilt of bloodshed be upon you." Notice that, then let's finish this out, verses 11 and 13, because that was talking about an accidental killing. Here is really the particular case in verse, for the story that the woman tells. This is where this really comes in. Verse 11, "But if anyone hates his neighbor, lies in wait for him, rises against him, and strikes him mortally so that he dies, and he flees to one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and bring him from there, and deliver him over to the hand of the avenger of blood, that he may die. Your eyes shall not pity him, but ye shall put away the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, that it may go well with you." Now that is particularly important because she is invoking, or she wants the avenger of blood to not destroy her son, which, if this had been an accidental killing, she's in the right. But we know that this is not an accidental killing, just like Absalom's killing of Amnon was not accidental. It was premeditated. He planned it out. And so, in this story, this idea of not allowing the avenger of blood to destroy this man doesn't really fit in for her because this wasn't an accidental killing. Just like in David's mind, he cannot use this excuse that, Absalom has fled away and Gershom was not a city that was mentioned as a city of refuge. But David could not use this concept of, well, he's fled to this city, and as long as he stays in that city, he doesn't have to worry about me putting him to death. David cannot use that as an excuse because Absalom performed a premeditated murder of his own brother. And so part of the point that's coming out from this is that this whole matter between Absalom and Amnon, David cannot just overlook it and welcome Absalom back as though Absalom did nothing wrong. Absalom does deserve to be punished. Which again, as we've pointed out, would not have been the case if David had done the right thing from the very get-go and not allowed Absalom to take matters into his own hands. But then again, notice the end of verse 11. As the Lord lives, David says, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. But again, the problem is that in this story, this individual, by the law of Moses, was supposed to be put to death because this was not an accidental killing, just like Absalom was supposed to be put to death because it was not an accidental killing. Well, that being said, we're actually out of time at this point. But are there any final comments that you want to add on to before we stop here in verse 12 and pick up in verse 12 next week?
Well, she's begging for mercy. The law said you die, just like us today. I mean, because of sin, I deserve eternal condemnation. But mercy says I don't have to have that. So,
right.
She pleaded for mercy, just like we today need to plead for mercy.
Right. And in this particular case, it's God who provides mercy, at least in that sense, when it comes to the consequences of sin. But again, David's responsibility is, at least in part, to follow what the law of Moses said, which David had not done that with his own son. So we'll pick up here in verse 12 next week and continue on with this account in David's life. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention this morning.